Welcome to the Higher Ed Live archives. This is a special intro to the show because when we went live, we had a little bit of a server crash and we lost the beginning part of the show for the recording. But that's what happens when you have a live show. So this is a special archive intro just for you guys. I am your host, Seth Odell. Higher Ed Live is the live weekly web show all about the world of higher education. We cover digital development, professional empowerment, and anything else you want us to talk about. Right off the bat, let me thank our sponsors. Higher Ed Live is sponsored by Integral. Integral are the creators of the Schools app on Facebook. Be sure to check out their webinar series about how they can help you leverage Facebook to increase yield and retention. That happens this Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, Omni Update is the leading web content management system CMS provider for higher education. The company's web CMS OU campus is secure and scalable with great tools and features, deployment flexibility, and an awesome user community. In fact, it was the highest ranked CMS in customer satisfaction in a 2010 .edu Guru survey. So if you need a CMS, check it out at omniupdate.com. Guys, thank you so much for being here today. Today is an awesome show with an amazing guest, a dear friend of mine, a bit of a mentor, an amazing man all around. Mark Greenfield is here. Mark is going to be talking with us about web governance. Web governance is a topic that isn't that sexy, I know, but it's one of the most important topics that we need to be talking about right now in higher education. As our industry moves forward with different changes, it's really important for us to look at how we leverage the web, how it's currently decentralized, and what we can do to bring it together to do our jobs better, save money, and make the web presence and web structure and institution as a whole just better. Our guest is Mark Greenfield. This is an awesome show, guys. As I said, this is an intro recorded just for the archive because we had a crash, so I already know the show's awesome. I already hosted it. I already talked with Mark, and it was really great. So let's get right into the show, check it out, and we'll start with the Weekly 5. So the Weekly 5, 5 stories from around the world and the web that are worth reading and following. 5 stories that we think you guys should know about. Let's check out what we have in store this week. Going on, number 1. Porn on higher education websites and porn on harvard.edu. Really interesting article that came out about porn, links to porn popping up on edu websites. Very nerve-wracking stuff. It's pretty scary, and this article talks about not just Harvard being hit, but some other schools as well, and it does talk about how to protect yourself. So as we talk about web governance today, I think it's really important to note that we should all keep in mind that there's a lot of risks when you are decentralized. This article talks about how some of the issues with Harvard were wikis that were set up without real security, some forum issues. So when you talk about security on the web, that plays right into web governance, and that plays right into what we're talking about today. Number 2, are colleges marketing to students that they don't actually want? This was a really interesting article that I read about some students' experiences that were receiving a lot of material from schools that in the end didn't really have any interest in accepting them. And it was a really unfortunate thought that schools were out there marketing to students as a way to boost their application numbers when they knowingly were possibly reaching out to students that weren't really qualified to get in. You can fall on either side of the fence here where the school's just trying to search for the best students and really cast a wide net, or is there something mischievous going on behind the scenes? Either way, I thought it was a really interesting read and worth checking out. Also, we talk a lot about the futures of libraries here on Higher Ed Live. I put a few other links out here before. There's a new University of Chicago library that is built in a bubble, and all the books are underground. Crazy. Very crazy, right? So yeah, all the books underground, and it's a robot that's used to pick them up. So very crazy. I thought it was awesome. Check out their library if you haven't seen it yet before. Next up, is Facebook killing college reunions? This is another great article that was out talking about how reunion attendance is down and influence is down, and that Facebook is to blame. And my question is, if that is the case, does that matter? I'm not sure. What is the point of reunions? Are obviously to make people connected, to keep them interested in each other, but also in your institution as a whole. And you know what? If Facebook's doing that, do we still need reunions? I'm just not sure if we do. So good read. I don't know where you guys fall on that. And then lastly, I was very lucky this week to be out in New Hampshire with the great folks at the Southern New Hampshire University for their commencement. Here's a nice little view from me in the back. And I got to give a quick shout out to the president, who I already gave one shout out to, I think, last week or the week before. But their president actually sent a tweet out of a photo while on stage at the podium. So as far as I know, this has got to be the first tweet from a podium by a president ever. I just thought it was pretty great. Got to give him a shout out. Because he really did a great job of interacting with the online audience. Not just interacting with those in the rooms, but saying hello to everybody around the world. So I got to think that was pretty cool. And lastly, guys, we have an official unsolicited shout out of the week every week where I pick one person, place, thing, or idea that I shout out because I think it's awesome. and you should too. So this week's unsolicited shout out goes to the Prey Project. Prey Project is an open source project that helps you track your laptops, and if they're stolen, can help you get them back. You can set it up on your computers. I have it on my MacBook Pro, and it is essentially what happens if you report your laptop stolen. You can turn on the webcam, take a picture of whoever's using it. You can track what wireless networks they sign into, where they are. A lot of information. It's entirely free. This isn't only just for your personal laptops, but keep in mind if you do work in an institution where you're at all in charge of equipment, you can set this up on multiple machines. So it's a free solution that does provide some security. So I got to say that so far my experience with the Prey project has been pretty cool. So that's the unsolicited shout out. That's the weekly 5. And now it's time to get into the program. So I am hearing from a few guys that we're having a few issues with the service today. I do apologize. We are going to work through that. But we're going to dive right into the topic today at hand. So I'm going to pull Mark right up. We're going to talk all about web governance. So Mark, again, thanks for coming on the show. As we're talking about web governance today, I think we should start with obviously the most basic question. So what is web governance for folks that aren't familiar?
Sure. Let me give you kind of a more informal definition than I normally use. I would describe web governance as being a process or framework that allows you to create the best website in the most cost-efficient manner possible. And to me, web governance is really about doing things right. It's about having the right people making the right decisions. It's about having the right amount of resources devoted to the web. And it's about working on the right projects, about really having a process to prioritize things to make sure we are really focusing on what we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. And I think you bring up a point that is a little bit of a challenge to sometimes define it, but I think your definition really does work and it captures what it's supposed to be. So, as we're talking about web governance in higher education today, is there any way to briefly say, where is it right now? I mean, how does it exist in our industry, or does it at all? Is this a practice that isn't actually, replicated in any college or university yet?
Right. Based on my experience, this is something that is rarely done on a college campus. Let me share with you a quick story. I was at a event last fall where we had about 100 senior executives in the room. So these are people, presidents, provosts, vice presidents, talking about the web. And I spent about 20 minutes talking about web governance and asked for a show of hands. How many of you in the room know why you have a website? And there was just kind of nervous chatter, a couple giggles. Finally, somebody raised their hands and said, because everybody else has one. So to me, it really illustrated how little senior executives have thought about the web. And in my opinion, going forward, we have to get them thinking more about why the web matters and make sure that it's properly resourced. And as crazy as it sounds, I think web governance is the right way to kind of approach this problem.
So let's break down a little bit more about what web governance is and why we need it. What are some of the benefits if it was implemented in higher education that we could see come through? Obviously, it's a loaded question. There's a lot there, but what are some highlights,
Sure.
at least for you to start with?
Well, the reason why web governance matters right now is that we're seeing more and more very compelling evidence about why the web matters, which I don't think has been there, especially going back maybe 10 or 15 years ago. The one stat that I use all of the time came from last year's Noel Levitt's e-expectation survey, where 1 in 4 students admitted that they had taken a college off of their list because of a bad web experience. Think about that. That is a huge, huge number. So I think, we're seeing a lot more evidence that the web really does matter. And then you combine this with everything I've been talking about, higher education getting flattened. The growing, we've been using the tag flatten, we've been using the tag Axeman out on Twitter, and we're seeing more and more evidence that, the phrase I like to use right now is that we need to become ruthlessly efficient, that we really have to focus on cost. And I think that the web provides a way inherently to be efficient with the way that we conduct business. The other thing that I think we need to focus on is the risk involved with doing the web incorrectly. Let me just share with you a couple quick examples. When I'm doing consulting work, one of the first things I look at is how is tuition talked about across a college website? And 99 out of 100 times, I find more than one listing for what tuition is on a campus. And to me, there is definitely inherent risk in that, because I wouldn't want to be working in the bursar's office when somebody walks in with what looks like an official web page saying that tuition is actually thousands of dollars less. Let me share with you another story, which is even more compelling. This happened about 3 years ago with a campus I was working with, where they had an international student from China, a master's level student, decide to attend that campus based specifically on a master's degree that was being offered. So this student went through all of the headache of, applying for a visa, getting all the paperwork in place, shows up on campus the very first day, only to find out that major is no longer offered. And now they're in the US and really have no place to go, and really was a nightmare for the student and a PR headache for the school. I can just imagine if that would have happened in today's social media world, the kind of, that would have just taken off like wildfire out on social media channels. So I think we need to look at how do we control that inherent risk. And let me just share one other thing about risk, which I think I don't have any personal examples of this happening, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens in the near future. I am amazed at the number of web shops that are comprised of one person. And I always ask senior leadership the question, what happens if that person decides to leave tomorrow and now you're stuck? You have no backup, you have no redundancy, you have this very important website out there with nobody to take care of it.
Mhm. I think risk is a huge issue. That's a really good point. There are a lot of shops set up that don't have that kind of contingency plan for how do you plan for the future, if someone does leave, and you can't always leave everything on one person's shoulders. There's a lot of examples like that. I really do think that the point you make is really good too, that we are just now experiencing an acceptance from higher levels in the administration on the importance of the web in general. That's something that did take a lot of time to evolve, and why is really kind of basic. Because when the web emerged, obviously it started in pockets across campus. And when the web was first on campus, this department wanted to do their website, or someone wanted to set something up, and organically it seemed in higher education, a lot of ways the web kind of grew just kind of sporadically here and there all over the place. But the problem is, we're talking about years and years and decades ago that this has started, and now we're at a point now where, if not now, when we actually have to step back and kind of figure out how to organize and strategize and do this. So it does seem like the timing is there, at least on some level, to kind of make this a priority within an institution.
Yep, I agree with that.
Yeah, it should be interesting. So, why haven't, going a little bit further than just the fact that, okay, maybe when the web started in higher ed, it kind of started in pockets, why else haven't we done this yet? Why is this something that hasn't kind of taken off at this point?
Well, I mean, at a very high level, the web is almost by definition very organic and very free. It's the wild, wild west. That's one of the reasons why it has worked. And in talking with people outside of higher education, the notion of web governance is an issue everywhere. It is not unique to higher ed. But I also think that it's even a bigger challenge in higher ed because you combine that, organic feeling to everything with the decentralization in higher education, combined with academic freedom in higher education. And the idea of trying to govern something that is almost ungovernable really becomes a challenge. And I think another problem is just the word governance. I know that has a very negative connotation with a lot of web folks and a lot of people in higher education. And I've been struggling to try to come up with a better word to describe what I'm talking about. And if anybody's got any ideas, let me know. We had this discussion on Twitter earlier this week, and it almost gets into semantics a little bit, but I think the idea of giving due diligence to how the web gets managed and funded is really what this is all about. And I just gave this presentation, or a presentation on this topic, up at the post-secondary education conference in Toronto 2 days ago. And one of my messages for the people in the audience, which were all web folks, was that governance is your friend. Don't think of this as something that's going to make your life harder to do. Think of it as something that will help you get more resources. I asked for a show of hands about how many people wish they had more money, and every single hand in the room went up. To me, web governance, part of this process is making sure that you're getting the appropriate amount of resource, and really going through the process of articulating why the web matters and showing the value that the web can provide. That's something I don't think we've done a good enough job of to date, which is really being able to articulate in words that management understands why the web matters and the value that it can provide.
Absolutely. So now, where do we start with this? At what point, where does the strategy start in putting this together? Is this something where you'd sit down as an institution, put together a committee, and put a strategy together? Like, how does this actually form, do you think? There's probably not one way, obviously, but is there a best practice or something that you think works the best for institutions that do want to tackle this as an issue?
I think the best approach is to get all of your ammunition in order about why the web matters, both from the recruitment aspect, just kind of the marketing recruitment aspect about, there's a lot of good data out there about that, plus about the inherent efficiencies and how you can be more efficient in terms of how the web works. You need to get that argument in place. Then you need to become a web evangelist and share that with everybody you can on campus. Hopefully, you can kind of move it up the chain of command. I know one of the frustrations I hear from a lot of web folks is they're too far down the chain of command to
Hmm.
feel that they can talk to somebody in a very authoritative position. But I think that if you get your ducks in a row and work your way up that chain of command, you can get the attention of folks. The one slide I like to use comes from Jerry Maguire: show me the money. That is something that will automatically get the attention of administrators. If you can demonstrate the value of all of this, and that gets the conversation started, then they will start to think about how the web is resourced. Are the right people making the right decisions? Are we doing the right things? But you got to start with making that initial argument.
Mhm. That's a really good point, and I love the fact that you are mentioning that there are folks who feel a little, that they don't have power, that they're in a position where they're too low on the food chain, and it's really important. You're right, to be an evangelist, at least spark this conversation. Maybe you're not in a position to physically make it happen, but you're absolutely at any level in an institution always in a position to inspire people and have a conversation and get the ball rolling. That's always a possibility. So I think it's really important to mention that. Great question coming in from Patrick Powers, and this is one that I think everyone's going to want to know the answer to. Is do you have any examples of schools who have successfully tackled web governance? And I know he's asking probably because he's interested in himself, but I also would ask because anytime you're raising this within your own institution, people always ask, what are other schools doing? And here's an example where if you had anything in your back pocket, it could be nice to pull out and show people. So, Mark, are you seeing this anywhere in higher ed? Are there any examples at all out there yet that show you what it should look like or someone that's doing it well?
Unfortunately, I have very few examples of people doing this well. I know of one school in particular. I will want to get permission from them before I mention them specifically.
Hmm.
But there is one medium-sized school. I believe they have about 7,000 students. It is, a four-year college. The director of web services at that institution reports directly to the president.
Wow.
And that tells you a lot about how they value the web. And you know and to me, it's no coincidence that they actually have a very good website and are very innovative about what they do. I will check with them to make sure they're comfortable, and if they are, we can post it on HigherEdLive as a blog post, or I'll do it on my site as
Sure.
well. But
Absolutely.
again, my experience has been very few people do this right. And the larger the institution, the less likely that they've even given any thought to this. Large research universities most of them don't even have what I would call any kind of web governance structure. There is no web council, there's no high level web committee thinking about how the web gets impacted. And, I've had this conversation with a couple of folks over the last week, and we actually think that over the last few years, it seems like when the web first came along, it was kind of the latest, greatest thing people were thinking about a little bit. But now the executives have moved on to other things, and the web actually isn't as thought of as much as it was a few years ago.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great example, though. Let's say just a director of the web services reporting directly to the president. Even that, in what we're doing now, is pretty innovative. I think that's interesting. One thing to note, in the research that I've done, Mark, which is obviously, by the way, far less than your experience in this field, I did find that there are a lot of government agencies that at least have this conversation and kind of have put out what their model is. I'm sending out a link now, actually, that is a sample of governance models from government agencies. Now, it's not necessarily models that work or are really good, but they are at least out there on paper. Do you think it's important, in a way, for schools to sort of audit what they have now? If things created organically, it's important to at least start with where are we as far as a model, and then look at what kind of model you could try to move to in the future?
Yep, absolutely. And I see that we just had a post come out from Lisa Welshman, who is a friend of mine, and she has done a lot of work across a wide variety of vertical markets, a little bit in higher ed, a lot with health, a lot with nonprofit, a lot with Fortune 500 companies. And one of the things that's amazing to me when I talk with Lisa is how consistent the problems are across all of these vertical sectors. It is not unique to higher ed. I think starting with where you are now is a very logical way to do this. And I would look at it both in terms of, what is the risk of doing it that way? And are you being inefficient with trying to do it that way? Let me go back to the idea of that tuition where we're seeing different tuition showing up on different pages across a college website.
Mhm.
Think about the maintenance, the extra maintenance that goes into maintaining what may be several versions of the same information. Not only are you risking having some of that get out of date, you're also being inefficient by doing that. I am happy to see that a lot more people are looking at content management and looking at content strategically. That is a piece of the overall kind of strategy pie, not the entire piece, but certainly a starting point.
Mhm. Now, you've mentioned this a little bit briefly, but I want to get back into it a little bit. You talked about in kind of incorporating and involving not just the folks with the web, but obviously the folks that kind of handle the money, the financial side of things. Within a higher ed structure, what would that look like, and how important is it to bring those people to the table so they understand that even if they aren't the ones directly involved with the web, if they're helping pay for it, that they're clearly a really important figure in obviously the conversation around web governance?
Sure. I will post a sample web governance structure up on Flickr later tonight so people can take a look at this.
Great.
The one piece that I have always seen missing when it comes to an organizational structure is what I call line management. Those are the people who control resources. They have different terms on different campuses. The best way to think about this are the chief financial officers for every unit on a campus. And at a place, large research universities, there's actually a lot of people who play that role. But at the end of the day, they are the ones who are deciding what the money gets spent on. And my experience has been, without exception, that there is a complete disconnect between the work of the web governance body and line management. You need to be able to connect those two dots together to make sure that if the web committee says Project X is important, that the people who control the money know that and it gets properly funded. I think that is one of the biggest things that is missing right now from governance or web governance in higher ed.
Now, when we're talking about this is a pretty big overhaul that you're talking about structurally within an institution. I mean, obviously, everybody has their org charts that show who answers to who has what power, and those org charts weren't designed around the web. So when you talk about web governance, it is going to it's going to play out on a higher ed level where it is going to include HR and possibly change some things and some dotted lines. And in general, I would say that's a task that's incredibly difficult, not near impossible, but pretty close to it. But we're at a really interesting time in higher ed where we have a lot of changes coming up. I mean, I have to think, and I think you would agree that if there ever is a time to make some major structural shifts as far as within an institution, this might actually be the perfect timing to do it.
Yep, I agree completely with that. Higher ed, as I've been saying, is being flattened. In many ways, it might become obsolete. It's being changed tremendously. And I think people are looking now at change management and the organizational culture in higher ed. One of my favorite expressions now is that we have an education system that was built for a world that no longer exists. And I think more and more people are recognizing that and seeing the need to change at a very, high level, just how the organization works. And I think all of this lends itself to being the perfect opportunity to talk, talking about the web strategically.
Mm-hmm.
It's been kind of nice over the years that we've been out there doing our web work and nobody's really been paying attention. We've had some freedom, at least I've had some freedom to do what I think is the right thing to do. But the challenge now is that the web really does matter. And whether we like it or not, it is going to show up on the radar screens of folks. And I think we need to be ready for that. Let me share with you a quick quote from a recent presentation that Lisa Welshman did. And I think this really gets at the heart of this. And her quote goes like this: "Web teams can no longer be treated as an organizational ghetto, underfunded, out of sight, and out of mind of senior executives." I think that those days are over, and I think it's time to move forward.
I absolutely agree. I'd like to think that more folks do, and that we can continue to have this conversation. Let's expand a little bit more on some of the benefits on a very kind of on the ground level, because one of the things that I see is, Conversations has a lot in higher education is content control and putting out good content on the web. And one of the things that I love about web governance is the strategy behind it. That you can actually have documentation showing why are we here, what are we trying to do. Because right now it does seem that so much of the web is controlled by people that aren't interested in actually understanding it and putting things out, but it's more about just pasting whatever you want online. We all know that we've been told to do things from the top. You have to just put this up. Don't worry about it, whether it makes sense or not. and that across your website you see issues where, I mean, in terrible examples like we did mention today in the Weekly Five, like with Harvard's case or other schools, examples where your site's actually getting hacked and people don't know about it. But the more you spread out too, just the content's getting diluted. So that alone, I think, is a huge benefit. It seems that you're talking about putting really quality content that's not only accurate, like you mentioned, with the issue with tuition, but putting up accurate information, but also the kind of content you want up there. Because right now it seems that it's so easy to have silos on your campus where the web really works, people know what they're doing, and then throughout there's people that kind of just float alone, and they're putting content up, and there's no, I hate to say someone that's overseeing them, but some kind of strategy that's there to support them and kind of rein them in when they're doing the wrong thing. So I think the content alone would benefit hugely with this.
Yep, agreed. When I look at a college campus that is very decentralized, to me, what you have to do is try to balance autonomy with accountability. So let's go back to that tuition example. We may, because of the structure of a university, say, it's okay for Department X to list tuition on their individual pages. That's, we're decentralized. We'll provide that level of autonomy, but at the same time, we have to have accountability. So if that content doesn't get updated, there is consequence for that. Another thing related to all of this is the idea of policies versus recommendations or guidelines. I have seen a lot of campuses that think they have web policy, but in fact, they're not really web policy because there is no consequence for not doing things the way they're supposed to be done. So if there isn't consequences, by definition, that is not a policy anymore. That doesn't mean you come in heavy-handed and kind of force people to do things. One of my mantras is to educate rather than mandate, show people the risk of doing things incorrectly rather than, forcing things down at people. If you can show them why best practices work and why all of this matters, most people will understand that immediately and get right on board. And, let me just one other quick point. I was very interested last week in our discussion on HigherEdLive about the idea about how so many people in higher education are not proud of their portfolio. They have websites out there that in theory they're responsible for, but at the end of the day, they're not real proud of. And I think core to this issue is the concept of HIPPOS, HIPPOS, which, is the acronym for highest paid person's opinion. I first came across that concept almost 15 years ago when I switched into my first full-time job as a web professional. And it really has stuck with me about all because somebody has the power to make a decision does not mean they have the expertise to make a decision. And to me, that is one of the core components about web governance is making sure that the right people are making the decisions, that they have the core expertise, and at the same time are held accountable for those decisions. As I've talked with, our colleagues, most people would be comfortable. They would love to have more control about what actually happens on the website. And they're also comfortable taking the accountability factor of that. Hold me responsible if I don't do it right, but let me do what I know, because of my expertise is the right way to do things.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I'm really happy to hear you say that because that's something that we did talk about in Higher Ed Live. The episode on bleeding talent was that a lot of folks feel that one of the reasons they take freelance work or ultimately leave is because they're not proud of what they're responsible for. And that's a really difficult thing, and it is nice to know that these kind of things could shift that you're empowering the people that you bring in to utilize their talent and really be leaders on this. So, Mark, looking at the big picture, to kind of put a macro lens on this, what in your mind would be the perfect true web governance setup in higher education? Like, what does true web governance look like in a perfect world?
In a perfect world, whoever is responsible for the web reports directly to a campus COO, the Chief Operating Officer. Now, the challenge of using that term is that I don't know of any campuses that have somebody who would be designated as COO. So who plays that role on a campus varies. But I think that the web needs to report right to senior leadership, that there is a structure in place that has established the strategy that the entire campus adopts. One of the challenges of, what I would call true web governance is every unit on the campus has to be part of the conversation. That is certainly something that is not easy to do. It requires a great deal of leadership to accomplish, but the entire campus has to buy in strategically about why the web matters. I have several times over the last few months put out a tweet that says college websites are first and foremost an enrollment tool. I would say probably 90% of people agree with me on that, 10% don't. Whether you agree with me or not, the most important thing is that everybody on campus has to understand at a strategic level why you have a website. So you need to involve the entire campus. Then it's a matter of making sure that there is a process to manage everything going forward. And to me, it's more than just content management. It really is around that idea of prioritizing projects. I know in my job at UB, I typically have 50 projects on my plate at one single time. I am probably working on maybe 10 projects at a time. But what I like is we actually have a process in place that involves anytime somebody brings a project request forward, they have to justify why we should be doing this, what business problem is it solving, and we can look at this from an ROI perspective and make decisions based on how this benefits the university.
Mhm.
And I know for me personally, I don't want to be the person making a decision about whether we do a specific project or not. To me, that is the role of, the higher ups, the people I report to. I want to be part of that conversation. I like being in the reporting relationship I am right now because I am, I report right through the provost office right now, and I love it. I was part of our IT group for a while. I was part of our marketing group for a while. When I was in our marketing group, all we talked about was brand and marketing campaigns. Not that that's not important, but there's more to the web than just that. When I was in our IT group, we were talking about servers and networks, and the web was almost treated as a a help ticket, not necessarily the right approach to all of that. Working in the provost office, when I'm in a biweekly staff meeting, I am in a meeting with our director of admissions, our director of financial aid, the people who are, and I can sit there and think about what their problems are and how the web can help solve their problems. And then as a group, we decide what project should we be working on. And I don't see enough of that in higher ed right now. Too often projects are made because the hippo said we should be doing it, or the person who can yell the loudest says we should be doing it. There isn't enough focus on doing, the right thing at the right time for the right reason.
Right. Now, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And now going from that macro lens to a more micro lens, we had a question come in from Jason just saying, let me pull it up exactly what it was. It was, how do you control content when committee members are not the audience you care most about? So they're not prospectives, they're not parents, not alumni. So on a micro level, if you are on some kind of committee and the folks on the committee don't kind of have the same view as you, what do you do? How do you start on a micro level have this conversation with people that maybe aren't familiar with it?
One of the approaches I take is trying to put user-centered design at the heart of how we're going to approach the web. So I start with that specifically, that we are going to use, the websites are built for our students. They're not built for us. I remember when I interviewed into my current job, one of the things I said to the provost at the time was, you know what, I am going to build websites that you might not like, but they're not for you. They're for our students. Are you okay with that? And then I went through the whole process of user-centered design and how we would use focus groups and surveys and usability testing and personas and all of those kinds of tools to build these websites. But that's where I started. It doesn't matter necessarily what we think should be done. We're going to really focus on the students as the heart. So I started with that. Then the next thing is coming up with the standards that allow that to happen. And again, the challenge is we need to have a way to be able to enforce those standards. And, the one thing that I have seen from the few schools that are doing a very good job with web governance, the one single trait I see is the person responsible for the web has unbelievably good leadership skills. You have got to be able to lead people through what can be a very challenging topic. And my recommendation for people who work on the web, in addition to your technical skills and even your management skills, focus also on your leadership skills. Let me bring up real quick, if I can find it, a quote from Peter Drucker. And I use this in my web governance presentation. And it goes like this: there is nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the difference between management and leadership. Management is making sure that people are climbing up the ladder correctly. Leadership is making sure that the ladder is leaning against the right wall. So there is a difference there. And one of the things I would like to see more of us in higher ed doing is taking on that leadership role. And you know what? We can do it. I have been absolutely amazed about the quality of people working in our profession over the last few years. I'm fortunate enough to go out to many, many conferences, and the technical skills, the enthusiasm, the commitment is all there. And my recommendation to all of my colleagues in higher ed is let's start working on those leadership skills. I am very confident that if we start doing that, we can start down the road of really not only making the web better, but going back to the idea about why so many of us are out there doing things on the side, because I don't think we're fully passionate about our full-time job. I think if we start taking this leadership role, we can start to change the momentum on that a little bit.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's a really important point to make. As we've mentioned previously on Higher Ed Live, in the next 2 years, 40% of baby boomers are up for retirement. We are going to be seeing a shift over the next decade in leadership in higher education. Absolutely. And whether it stays in ivory tower or not, the folks at the top are definitely going to be different. And if we're starting these conversations and taking these leadership roles, wherever we are now on the ladder or on the food chain, however you want to say it, this is going to be something that trickles up over time, absolutely, and it needs to be a conversation that happens. So, Mark, for folks out there that want some more information, where do you get your information? What are some good online resources, or where can folks go to get more information on web governance in general if they just want to educate themselves and kind of get as much info as possible?
Sure. Let me share with you a couple of projects that I have going on right now. The first is that I'm working with our friends at EDU Guru to put together a survey specifically about web governance. The EDU Guru folks have done a couple of surveys that kind of touch on that indirectly, but we're putting together a survey that I hope to get done in the next few weeks that would, kind of address web governance questions so we can get some baseline data about what we're doing and what some of the issues are around this. So keep your eye out for that. Secondly is a website called webgovernance.com. That site is not up and running yet. We are hoping to have it live, I'm going to say mid to late June. And this is a project I'm working on right now with Lisa Welshman, who I mentioned before. If you're looking for a resource right now, Lisa Welshman has some great blog posts, some great white papers written about web governance. And while they're not directly, focused on higher ed, 99% of them are something I think you'll find valuable. So for this webgovernance.com website, I'm working with Lisa and a few other people from across the world to really focus on what web governance is all about. And the idea for this site is that it is going to be a platform for discussion. This is not going to just be, a list of articles and links. We are going to be using this as a place to have discussion. So I would encourage everybody to participate there. I've had a couple of posts on my blog about this. There will be a lot more coming about this from me in the next few months. So certainly be paying attention to my site. And the hashtag, for anybody who is out there on Twitter, the hashtag that I have been using to talk about higher or governance in higher ed is HEWebGov. So it's HEWEBGOV. So I would encourage everybody, as we're talking about this topic on Twitter, to use that hashtag. And I'll be out at many conferences over the summer and fall talking about this topic as well. So, I'd like to keep this discussion going. I think it's important, as we talked about before. It might not be the most glamorous thing to think about, but in my opinion, web governance is our friend. And when done correctly, it will actually give us, the resources that we need and really make it easier for us to do our jobs.
Yeah, Mark, I can't thank you enough for coming on and talk about the topic. As hearing you talk about this stuff, it's pretty obvious you are one of the men, the person to talk to, the man to talk to about this subject. I'm really excited for webgovernance.com. I'm going to keep an eye out for it. And, as you mentioned, it's not the sexiest topic, but it's one of the most important by far. And the thing that I find so interesting is when you really think about it, it's absolutely a win-win. That it works for those of us that work with the web or work in higher ed on any level, because it's going to give us the power to do what we do better, give us more resources, make things more logical, better structure, better setup, better content. But it also helps the people at the top. It's going to save them money. It's going to structure things better. It's going to save them money, and it's going to make what the web does more efficient and better for the institution as a whole. So to me, it's absolutely a win-win, and the only thing stopping it is at the end of the day, maybe us having this conversation with the right people and getting it to the right folks. And it's going to take time, I know, to educate folks at maybe, at the top that are in a chancellor's office or president's office to understand the process. But to me, it does seem like something that's going to benefit everybody involved. And if that's the case, then it is just a matter of having the conversation. And obviously in higher ed, things move slowly. So have the conversation over time. But it seems like this is an inevitability, at least at some point down the line, I hope.
Yep, I agree completely. One of the reactions people get when I talk about higher ed getting flattened and how we're going to get a lot more outsourcing, a lot of people walk away from that talk thinking I'm saying we're not going to have jobs 5 years from now. I think the exact opposite is going to happen. As people start looking very closely at how universities spend their money, they're going to see that in most cases, the web is underfunded. What we have to do is be in a position to really talk about why the web matters, how to do it correctly, how to do it efficiently. And at some point, somebody's going to knock on your door and want a justification about why you exist. Be ready to make a very compelling argument so people really understand what the web is all about. And I think that as people understand what we do better, they will realize that it really needs more funding rather than less funding.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think this is could not be a more important topic and a more important time to talk about it. I appreciate you being out there in general, doing the conference circuits, meeting folks, and bringing this up because we do need someone like you in the community that's going to raise it as an issue. Because I mean, you obviously have my attention. I think you have the attention of your colleagues in the industry, and hopefully, if we all go out and kind of have this conversation, it can start to spread. So, guys, we're just about wrapping up here. If you have any last minute question, get it in right now because I'm going to toss back to Mark with one question for you, Mark. What can we do tomorrow going into work to at least start having this conversation? Like, what's something that someone can do to at least get the ball slowly rolling so we can try and push this issue forward?
I'm actually going to give you two things that everybody should do tomorrow. One is if you had the opportunity to talk to whoever your chief executive is for 5 minutes about the web and about what your job is and about why it matters, think about that and put that in place. The second thing is to think about your operation as if it was your own business. Think about it as Web Services Incorporated. If you had, my title of Director of Web Services, think about if that was your own money that you were spending. There are a handful of folks out there that operate on a cost recovery basis. The only way that their office exists is because they charge money for their services. I think that for the most part, that's a bad idea because you're relying on the chief financial officers to make decisions that they don't necessarily understand. But the good part about that is it forces you to think like an entrepreneur. So if that was your budget, that was your money you were spending, would you spend it the same way? It doesn't. A lot of people think that you should have an unlimited budget. That's not going to happen. A lot of us would love to go to 20 conferences a year, but you know what? That's unrealistic. If that was your own money and your own business, would you spend it that way? So, think about how you can articulate the business case for what you do. And secondly, think like an entrepreneur. Think like it's your business and you're going to run it as efficiently and as productively as possible.
Great. I couldn't have said it better myself, Mark. I love it. I love the takeaways. I really hope folks go out tomorrow and do that. So, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I absolutely appreciate it. This is a great topic, and I appreciate your time as always. You've always been such a great guest on the show. I really can't thank you enough.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm always looking to be part of the conversation and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much, Mark. I really do appreciate it. And for folks watching, we are taking a small break next week. That's right. HigherEdLive is off next week. Sad Panda. Because we are actually getting a new studio for HigherEdLive. So that's very exciting. We're going to take one Sunday off, first one since Christmas, and put a new studio together. But we're going to be coming back June 5th with a new show and announcing some major guests and a summer tour. That's right, a summer tour. HigherEdLive coming to Orlando, coming to Austin, coming to Chicago, going to Albany, going to Boston. A lot going on. So June 5th, guys, we're back live with another show, big announcements. Please have a good Memorial Day weekend next week. Enjoy it. And lastly, I obviously want to thank our sponsors once again. Thank you to Integral, the creators of the Schools app on Facebook. Great group of guys and a great webinar they have every Friday. I'll send a link out if you are interested. And thank you to Omni Update. They are the awesome leading web content management system providers for higher education. If you don't know about their web CMS OU campus, which is secure and scalable, definitely check it out. I'm going to send a link out to that as well. So once again, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thanks to Mark. Check out HigherEdLive.com if you have any questions or anything else. And please, at any point, let us know if you have any ideas for guests or topics. We are always here to cover what you guys want to hear. So until next time, we'll be off next week. Thanks again, guys. I will talk to you soon.